The battlefield, chaos, cries, steel slicing through flesh, the gladius hits, and blood gushes out. Roman pride, they called it, but in that instant it feels more like torment. And then what? What happens to those who make it? Not the ones who fall with honor, but the ones who return, broken in soul and fractured in mind. Rome praised its generals with marble arches, its gods with offerings after every conquest. But the common fighter came back, changed, damaged, mutilated, bearing injuries no one cared to witness. This video is about them, the overlooked, the ones who made it back but never really came home. We're going to look into the lives of wounded fighters in ancient Rome, because the real face of battle doesn't show itself until the slaughter is done. Roman combat was vicious and face to face. There was no safe gap, no chance to breathe and strike vital spots with chilling accuracy. A quiet, deadly, and repetitive tool of war. But when it didn't kill outright, it left marks that never completely healed. Spears and pilums sliced through skin and bone, sometimes severing limbs in half. Darts with thick hooked heads were designed to bend on impact, making them hard to extract and causing deep wounds that rapidly became infected. And when the opponent was barbarian, like Celts or Germanic warriors, the damage could be even worse. Their weapons were rougher, but also more violent. Axes that tore off full arms, maces that smashed skulls, long blades that left raw, gaping gashes. Roman medical texts, especially De Medicina, by Aulus Cornelius Celsus, describe injuries beyond what is bearable: exposed organs, crushed bones, teeth ripped out, mangled faces. Many who endured the fight died days after, victims of rot, fevers, or creeping necrosis. There was no moment to clean anything. The wounded collapsed onto filthy earth, mixed with dirt, filth, and the blood of fallen men and beasts. If they were fortunate, they were carried off. If not, they were left lying until the slaughter ended. The pain didn't end with the fighting. In many cases, it was only beginning. But even when the body endured, the mind didn't always survive, because there was another war, a hidden one. There were fighters who came back with no visible cuts, no bruises, no limbs missing. But something inside them had cracked. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was already there in Rome, only without a label, without a diagnosis, and worse yet, without understanding. These men suffered alone. Endless insomnia, bursts of rage, sudden fears, detachment. Many lived in silence, unable to reconnect with their families or with normal life. Some rejoined the army, not out of duty, but out of hopelessness. Others simply faded from the world, living as outcasts or dying by their own hand. Roman society, however, didn't view this as a cost of war. It called it weakness, a failure of character. A true man, they said, endured all with honor. To feel deeply was questionable. To suffer quietly was expected. Tacitus, in his Annals, mentions veterans from the Germanic wars who avoided the company of their fellow Romans, ignored festivals, avoided human touch. They didn't speak of war as if simply recalling it was unbearable. They were breathing, but a part of them had perished on the field. Rome knew how to shape warriors. It knew how to destroy foreign legions. But it didn't know, or didn't bother, to accept those who returned shattered inside. Pain that left no blood was invisible to the empire. And when the pain did bleed, when skin was ripped open, when blood gushed, those who took control of it were men with a different kind of bravery. The Medici, legion doctors, army physicians trained not to save lives in today's sense, but to keep fighters alive just long enough for them to stay fighting. Roman medicine was harshly practical. Every fixed camp had a valetudinarium, a military clinic divided into separate sections: open wounds, illnesses, infections, and recovery. The Medici worked following the knowledge of writers like Celsus, Galen, and Dioscorides, using vinegar and wine as cleaners, and herbs like mandrake or willow bark to dull pain. But when an injury was critical, there were no wonders, only flame. And metal, cauterizing with blazing hot rods, was used to stop bleeding. However, if a wound started to decay, cutting it off was the only answer. The tools: bronze, saws, metal hooks, rough forceps, the numbing agent swine, and if lucky, some natural painkiller. The cries, according to sources, were heard across the entire camp. The death rate was high, but the Medici were both respected and feared, not because they cured, but because they chose who could be treated, who must lose a limb, and who wouldn't see the next dawn. They weren't healers. They were trauma surgeons in a time when every slice was a verdict. Even those who escaped their hands and lived through their wounds still faced one of the worst struggles, leaving the battlefield and finding a place where they might recover. If they were distant from a permanent camp, badly injured soldiers had to be moved under circumstances that now would be seen as brutal. Makeshift stretchers built with spears and cloaks, wagons without suspension dragged by oxen over paths of rock and mud. Every jolt was agony. Roman logistics were fast, but not gentle. The goal was to maintain numbers, not to ease the suffering of the wounded. When the fight had just ended and the ground was dangerous, many died during transit, suffering in silence between the shakes of Roman roads. In imperial periods, the growth of army infrastructure brought advances. The valetudinaria became standard. In big fixed camps, these simple facilities had spaces for separate treatments, some drainage for wastewater, wooden bunks, and basic collections of medical tools made from bronze or iron. But even in those clinics, safety was rare. The lack of insight into germs and disease meant that infection was almost a certain fate. Soldiers could dodge the enemy's blade, but not the invisible killers that bred in open wounds, filthy linens, and reused equipment. In the quiet of the valetudinarium, far from the noise of combat, a different war started against time, decay, and the breakdown of the soldier's own flesh. The deadliest threat to the seriously hurt was no longer the sword, but gangrene. Without antibiotics or real science of microbes, a minor stab could become a lethal source of raw tissue would turn black, and the stench would signal death before the fever did. The pain was called unbearable, steady burning, chills, madness. And while Roman physicians were seasoned, they were limited to guesswork. Plant poultices made from elder rue and garlic were used, remedies listed by Dioscorides in his De Materia Medica. Sometimes they helped ease swelling, other times they just slowed the end. Galen, one of the top healers of the ancient world, wrote that often the only real option was total removal of the injured limb, but even that, without proper cleanliness, could push the patient into septicemia, a widespread infection. Infection didn't care about heroes. Decorated warriors died just like green recruits, slowly with fever, resting on wooden cots at the fringes of an empire that could offer little. For them, the fight against gangrene wasn't epic. It had no honor, no witnesses. It was quiet, lonely, and brutal. But for those who managed to live, the next battle was something else. What did Rome do with the men who could no longer serve? Rome promised much to its troops, and it fulfilled those promises for some. Legionaries who lasted long enough to complete 20 or 25 years of service earned the missio honusta, an honorable release that brought solid compensation, a patch of land, a lifetime pension, even Roman citizenship if they were foreigners. Many of those veterans were relocated into army colonies and spent the rest of their days as farmers, shopkeepers, or community leaders. It was the prize for decades of blood and commitment, but most of the badly injured never made it that far. Many were released before hitting the required service term, under a category called missio castrans, a discharge justified by medical issues, symbolically respectful, sure, but lacking the guarantees of the missio honesta in real life. This meant returning home wounded, without government backing, no land, no pay. These veterans had to rely on the kindness of family, the mercy of former commanders, or just pure chance. Because Rome, despite worshipping the image of the soldier, rarely offered help to those who couldn't keep fighting. Statues praised the wins, the generals, the unbeatable legions, but never the shattered bodies that made those triumphs possible, nor the empty homes they limped back to. For every proud veteran who got recognition, there were dozens left behind in the backstreets of the provinces, crippled, shamed, and often pushed away by a culture that praised strength but looked down on weakness. Not every wounded man was tossed aside right away. The Roman army, practical as always, knew that even a hurt body had value, if the mind stayed sharp, and the hands could still write, direct, or observe. Soldiers who couldn't fight but could still contribute were often reassigned. Many became scribai, handling the camp's paperwork, inventory logs, pay records, movement lists. Others turned into trainers, passing down real combat lessons to fresh soldiers. Some ended up as guards in storage zones or towers, where the physical strain was lighter. This recycling of the injured body was more normal under steady and well-managed governments, like those of Trajan or Hadrian. But during periods of political unrest, money problems, or drawn-out wars, these chances dried up. Everything rested on timing, the local officer, the open slots, and sometimes the compassion of whoever was in charge. For lots of veterans, those desk jobs were a lifeline, a chance to keep some dignity and stay part of the system that had made them. But that chance was never promised. And for every man who found shelter inside the military engine, others dropped into ruin, not just because of their wounds, but because of their own decisions. Because if anything was worse than returning home damaged by war, it was coming back in disgrace. The missio ignominiosa was the harshest type of release in the Roman forces, given to those charged with cowardice, major desertion, misconduct, or actions seen as shameful for a soldier. It wasn't just removal, it was public humiliation. The man discharged in shame lost all his rights, no pension, no land, no respect. His name was wiped from the records with disgust. And in a culture obsessed with honor, that meant something. Deeper than poverty, it meant erasure. Many of those ex-soldiers lived at the edges of society, unemployed, vulnerable, stripped of pride. There are carvings on borders like Britannia that reveal the presence of men who, even injured, were marked with disgrace and carried that burden to the grave. Other sources speak of veterans ignored even by their own relatives, as if they carried a moral curse. In Rome, virtue, bravery, order, loyalty was the core of the masculine identity. To lose that was to be cast out not only from the army, but from the entire idea of citizenship. For many injured veterans, the war ended, but the fight to survive did not. Without promised pensions, without land, without family backing, these men had to discover some way to earn a living, even with bodies worn by pain. Some used the little they had gained upon leaving the army to open modest taverns, repair stalls, or work as street traders. Others pursued low-level civil roles in towns and provinces: market inspectors, city guards, administrative clerks. These were modest jobs, but they offered structure and sometimes dignity. But there were also those who followed a darker route. Wounded, yet still able to carry a weapon, they became hired fighters, selling their combat training to senators, nobles, or merchant convoys. Others entered gladiator schools, where violence became livelihood once again, now as sport. Such was the fate of figures like Spiculus, a popular gladiator during the time of Nero, whose possible roots were military. The arena gave fame and rewards, but also a fast death. For many, it was the only way to turn their pain into income, a brutal deal, honor for food. The Rome that carved warriors into marble statues also sold their misery in games for the crowds. And among the options of a hard life, death in the arena sometimes seemed more noble than being forgotten. For veterans who couldn't receive land, employment, or any path to reintegration, the harshest fate remained to survive without meaning. In cities like Rome, Alexandria, or Carthage, it was common to find former injured soldiers surviving on the streets, reduced to begging, with missing limbs, faded scars, and empty eyes. These were men who once marched with the mightiest legions in the world, now begging in the shadows of temples. Some weren't even identified as veterans. They had been erased by the system, by society, by everyone. The honor that once sustained them had disappeared. Emperor Augustus tried to fix this issue by founding the Aeraria Militaire, a military reserve funded by taxes intended for the payout of pensions. In theory, it was a breakthrough, an official safety net for those it served, and for a while it functioned. Under capable emperors like Vespasian, the fund was expanded, but under others like Nero, it was misused or drained for royal extravagance. The reality is that in times of crisis, the first to be discarded were those who could no longer serve. Many veterans died waiting for a pension that never arrived. Others were rescued by minor civil tasks given by officers or regional officials. But most vanished, absorbed by the nameless masses of an empire that knew how to use their strength, but never how to heal their wounds. Rome won battles across 3 continents, crushed kingdoms, founded cities, and raised monuments that still challenged time. Behind every triumph carved in marble, there were thousands of shattered men bleeding for an empire that often abandoned them once they stopped being useful. This video is not about commanders or fame. It's about the regular soldiers, those who lost arms, sight, comrades, and came home only to find silence, neglect, or suffering. It's about a debt the empire owed each of them and never truly settled. Because surviving Roman war was only the start of another fight. Against rejection, lasting pain, lack of purpose, and, for many, against being forgotten. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel so more voices from the past can be remembered, and comment below. Do you believe Rome owed more to its warriors? And as always, may Mars watch over you in battle.